old cemetery sits on a hillside overlooking what was once a thriving mill town in western Pennsylvania. Most visitors walk past the weathered headstones without giving them a second glance, but if you know what to look for, you'll notice something peculiar about one particular section. 7 graves, all bearing the same surname, all dating from the same decade. The Whitmore family plot tells a story that the living tried desperately to forget, a tale so disturbing that for over a century, the townsfolk have spoken of it only in hushed whispers behind closed doors. What really happened to the Whitmores? Why did an entire bloodline vanish from the face of the earth in less than 10 years? And more importantly, what dark secrets were they hiding that someone was willing to kill to protect? This is the true story of one of America's most twisted family mysteries, a saga of greed, betrayal, and unspeakable acts that shocked a nation and left investigators baffled for generations. The year was 1887, and America was changing rapidly. The Industrial Revolution had transformed sleepy farming communities into bustling centers of commerce, and nowhere was this more evident than in the coal mining regions of Pennsylvania. It was here, in the shadow of the Allegheny Mountains, that Jeremiah Whitmore first made his mark on history. But unlike the honest, hard-working miners who descended into the earth each day to feed their families, Jeremiah had discovered a far more lucrative way to extract wealth from the mountain soil. Jeremiah wasn't just another businessman trying to strike it rich during America's Gilded Age. He was a man with a vision, albeit a twisted one, and the ruthless determination to see it through no matter the cost. Those who knew him described a tall, gaunt figure with piercing gray eyes that seemed to look right through a person's soul. His angular face was framed by a perfectly groomed beard, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed the world owed him everything he desired. Born into poverty in 1834, Jeremiah had clawed his way up from nothing through a combination of cunning, manipulation, and what some folks whispered was an unholy pact with forces better left undisturbed. By the time he reached his 30th birthday, he owned 3 general stores, a lumber mill, and had his fingers in more business dealings than most people could count. But wealth alone wasn't enough for Jeremiah Whitmore. He craved power, respect, and most of all, he wanted to build a legacy that would ensure the Whitmore name would be remembered long after he was gone. That obsession with legacy would prove to be his family's ultimate downfall. In 1865, Jeremiah married Margaret Sullivan, the daughter of a prominent local banker. Margaret was everything a successful businessman could want in a wife during that era. She was beautiful, well-educated, and came from a family with both money and social standing. But those who knew the couple best noticed something unsettling about their relationship from the very beginning. Margaret, once known for her bright smile and infectious laughter, seemed to grow more withdrawn and fearful with each passing month of marriage. The whispers started almost immediately after the wedding. Servants at the Whitmore estate spoke of strange sounds echoing through the halls at night, of Margaret's muffled crying that could be heard through the thick wooden doors of the master bedroom, and of Jeremiah's explosive fits of rage that would send the entire household staff scurrying for cover. But in those days, what happened between a man and his wife was considered private business, and no one dared to interfere with the affairs of the town's most powerful family. Over the next 15 years, Margaret bore Jeremiah 5 children. There was Samuel, the eldest son who was groomed from birth to take over the family empire. Then came the twins, Joshua and Caleb, followed by their sister Abigail, and finally little Thomas, who arrived when Margaret was already well into her 40s. To the outside world, the Whitmores appeared to be the perfect American family. They attended church every Sunday, hosted elaborate dinner parties for the town's elite, and Jeremiah was known for his generous contributions to local charities. But behind the walls of the imposing Victorian mansion that dominated the center of town, something far more sinister was taking root. The first signs of trouble became apparent when Samuel reached his teenage years. Teachers at the local academy reported that the boy had become increasingly violent and unpredictable. He would fly into rages over the smallest perceived slights, and more than once, other students were sent home with injuries that couldn't be easily explained away as simple schoolyard scuffles. When confronted about his son's behavior, Jeremiah would simply smile that cold, calculating smile of his and assure everyone that boys would be boys, and that Samuel was just showing the kind of spirit that would serve him well in the business world. The twins, Joshua and Caleb, presented their own unique problems. Despite being identical in appearance, their personalities couldn't have been more different. Joshua was quiet and withdrawn, spending most of his time alone in his room reading books about anatomy and medicine. Caleb, on the other hand, was charming and outgoing, with a silver tongue that could talk his way out of any trouble. But those who looked closely noticed that Caleb's charm had a predatory quality to it, and more than one young woman in town found herself the victim of his unwanted advances. Abigail, the only daughter, seemed to be the most normal of the Whitmore children, at least on the surface. She was intelligent, well-mannered, and genuinely seemed to care about the welfare of others. But even she couldn't escape the dark influence that permeated every corner of the Whitmore household. As she grew older, neighbors began to notice that she rarely left the house without being accompanied by one of her brothers, and when she did venture out alone, she had a haunted, fearful look in her eyes that reminded many people of her mother. Little Thomas, the youngest of the clan, was perhaps the most tragic figure of all. Born sickly and weak, he spent most of his childhood confined to his bed, tended to by a series of nurses who never seemed to stay with the family for very long. Those few servants who did remain in the Whitmore employ long enough to observe the family dynamics closely reported that Thomas seemed terrified of his own father and brothers, and would often cry inconsolably whenever any of them entered his room. As the 1880s progressed, the Whitmore family's reputation in the community began to shift from one of respect and admiration to something far more complex and troubling. People still tipped their hats when they passed Jeremiah on the street, and local businessmen still sought his approval for their ventures, but there was an undercurrent of fear that hadn't been there before. Stories began to circulate about strange lights seen flickering in the windows of the Whitmore mansion late at night, about deliveries made under cover of darkness, and about the increasing number of travelers who seemed to disappear after stopping in town to conduct business with the family. The local sheriff, a man named Deputy Marshal, who owed his position to Jeremiah's political influence, dismissed these concerns as nothing more than idle gossip and small-town superstition. But even he couldn't ignore the mounting evidence that something deeply disturbing was happening within the walls of the Whitmore estate. It was during the harsh winter of 1886 that the first concrete evidence of the family's dark activities came to light. A traveling salesman named Henry Morrison had arrived in town in early December, carrying with him a satchel full of expensive jewelry and pocket watches that he intended to sell to the region's wealthy families. Morrison was last seen alive entering the Whitmore mansion on a snowy Thursday evening. When he failed to appear at his scheduled appointments the following week, concerned business associates contacted the authorities. Deputy Marshal conducted what could generously be called a cursory investigation. He questioned Jeremiah, who claimed that Morrison had never visited the mansion at all. The family's servants, when pressed, all provided identical accounts of that evening, insisting that no traveling salesman had come to call. But several townspeople reported seeing Morrison's distinctive wagon parked outside the Whitmore estate on the night in question, and his horse was later found wandering loose near the old mill pond, still wearing its harness, but with no trace of either the wagon or its owner. The Morrison disappearance might have been dismissed as an isolated incident, perhaps the result of bandits who had waylaid the unfortunate salesman somewhere along the mountain roads. But it wasn't long before other disturbing events began to pile up like storm clouds on the horizon. A young woman named Sarah Beth Coleman, who had been employed as a governess for little Thomas, suddenly vanished without collecting her final wages or even gathering her personal belongings from her room. When her family came looking for her, they were told that she had left town suddenly to care for a sick relative, but no one could explain why she would abandon her trunk full of clothes and her grandmother's jewelry. Then there was the case of Dr. William Hartwell, the elderly physician who had been treating Thomas for his various ailments. Dr. Hartwell had confided to his wife that he was deeply concerned about the boy's condition, not because of any physical illness, but because of what appeared to be signs of severe psychological trauma. He had scheduled a meeting with local authorities to discuss his concerns, but before that meeting could take place, the good doctor suffered what appeared to be a fatal heart attack while making a house call to the Whitmore estate. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore, even for those who preferred to look the other way. Anyone who got too close to the Whitmore family's secrets had a disturbing tendency to either disappear entirely or meet with sudden, unexpected deaths. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of these incidents was how seamlessly they were covered up, how quickly the official explanations emerged, and how efficiently any physical evidence seemed to vanish. What made the situation even more unsettling was the way the Whitmore children seemed to be changing as they grew older. Samuel, now in his early 20s, had taken over much of the day-to-day management of the family's business interests, and those who dealt with him reported that he had developed his father's cold, calculating demeanor, along with an almost supernatural ability to intimidate anyone who crossed him. The twins had grown into young men who seemed to operate as two halves of the same malevolent whole. Joshua had completed his medical studies through private tutoring, though no reputable institution would claim him as a graduate. His knowledge of human anatomy was said to be encyclopedic, But neighbors whispered that his understanding came from sources far more disturbing than textbooks. Caleb, meanwhile, had established himself as the family's liaison with the outside world, using his natural charisma to smooth over any questions or concerns that arose about their activities. As for Abigail, now a woman of 22, she had become increasingly reclusive, rarely venturing beyond the grounds of the family estate. When she did appear in public, usually at church services or community gatherings, she moved like a person walking through a waking nightmare. Her once bright eyes had taken on the same haunted quality that had marked her mother in her final years, and more than one observer noted that she seemed to flinch whenever any member of her family came too close. The transformation of the Whitmore children from seemingly normal youngsters into the disturbing adults they had become did not go unnoticed by the community. But what truly sent chills through the hearts of longtime residents was the realization that this change seemed to coincide with a series of modifications that Jeremiah had made to the family mansion. Beginning in 1884, construction crews had been hired to make extensive renovations to the already imposing structure. Workers reported that they were building additional rooms in the basement levels, rooms that seemed to serve no obvious domestic purpose. The walls of these new chambers were unusually thick, and Jeremiah had insisted on installing heavy steel doors with multiple locks. Most disturbing of all, the workers noted that several of these basement rooms had been fitted with drainage systems that led to underground tunnels, though no one could explain why such features would be necessary in what was supposedly a family residence. The construction work was carried out in secrecy, with different crews handling different aspects of the project, so that no single group of workers could get a complete picture of what was being built. Those who asked too many questions about the purpose of these modifications found their employment terminated immediately, and more than one former worker reported being threatened with serious consequences if they discussed what they had seen with anyone outside the Whitmore family. Local suppliers began to notice unusual orders coming from the Whitmore estate during this period. Large quantities of lime, sawdust, and industrial-grade cleaning chemicals were delivered on a regular basis, along with medical instruments that seemed far too sophisticated for treating young Thomas's minor ailments. Most puzzling of all were the orders for heavy canvas tarps, leather restraints, and what appeared to be embalming equipment. When questioned about these purchases, Jeremiah would simply explain that he was expanding his business interests into new areas, including a small medical practice to serve the growing population of mill workers. The explanation seemed plausible enough on the surface, but those who knew the family well wondered why such a practice would require the level of secrecy that surrounded all of the Whitmore's activities. By the spring of 1887, the atmosphere in town had grown increasingly tense. Too many people had disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances, and too many disturbing rumors were circulating about the Whitmore family for the community to continue ignoring what was happening. But Jeremiah's influence over local law enforcement and political leaders remained absolute, and anyone who tried to organize opposition to the family quickly found themselves facing financial ruin or worse. It was during this period of mounting tension that a stranger arrived in town who would ultimately prove to be the catalyst for everything that followed. His name was Detective Inspector William Crawford, and he had been sent by the state authorities to investigate the growing number of missing persons reports that had been filed in connection with the region. Crawford was not the type of man who could be easily intimidated or bought off. A veteran of the Civil War and a seasoned investigator with the Pennsylvania State Police, he had dealt with some of the worst criminals the state had to offer. But even Crawford would later admit that nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for what he would uncover about the Whitmore family. The detective's arrival did not go unnoticed by Jeremiah, who immediately set about trying to neutralize this new threat to his carefully constructed empire of secrets. He invited Crawford to dinner at the mansion, hoping to charm the investigator the same way he had manipulated so many others over the years. But Crawford was not impressed by the family's wealth or social standing, and he began asking pointed questions about the various disappearances that had occurred in recent months. What Crawford observed during that dinner would haunt him for the rest of his life. The family members seemed to communicate through subtle glances and barely perceptible gestures, as if they were all part of some elaborate, sinister performance. Young Thomas, now 12 years old, appeared terrified throughout the entire meal, barely touching his food and jumping at every unexpected sound. Most disturbing of all was the way the other family members seemed to take pleasure in the boy's obvious distress. Margaret Whitmore, now in her early 50s, had become a mere shadow of her former self. She sat at the dinner table like a broken doll, responding to questions with single-word answers and staring off into space with the vacant expression of someone whose spirit had been completely crushed. When Crawford attempted to engage her in conversation about her children or her life in the community, she would glance nervously at her husband before mumbling some incoherent response. But it was Jeremiah himself who made the strongest impression on the detective. Throughout the evening, the patriarch of the Whitmore clan maintained the facade of a gracious host, but Crawford could sense something predatory lurking beneath the surface politeness. There was a quality to Jeremiah's smile that reminded the detective of the expression he had seen on the faces of the most dangerous criminals he had encountered, a look that suggested the man was constantly calculating how to turn every situation to his advantage. As the evening progressed, Crawford began to notice other disturbing details about the household. Servants moved through the dining room like frightened ghosts, never making eye contact with the family members and jumping to obey even the slightest gesture from Jeremiah or his sons. The house itself seemed to have an oppressive atmosphere that went beyond what could be explained by its dark wood paneling and heavy furnishings. There was an underlying smell that the detective couldn't quite identify, something that reminded him of the field hospitals he had visited during the war. Most unsettling of all were the sounds that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within the house. During quiet moments in the conversation, Crawford could hear what sounded like muffled crying or moaning coming from below, though when he asked about it, Jeremiah simply explained that they were having problems with the furnace and that strange noises were common in old houses. By the time Crawford left the Whitmore mansion that evening, he was convinced that he had stumbled upon something far more sinister than a simple case of missing persons. The challenge would be proving it, especially when dealing with a family that had spent decades perfecting the art of making problems disappear. The detective began his investigation in earnest the following morning, starting with interviews of the townspeople who had reported missing relatives or friends. What he discovered was a pattern of disappearances that stretched back nearly a decade, involving people from all walks of life who had one thing in common. They had all had some form of contact with the Whitmore family shortly before they vanished. There was Martha Henderson, a seamstress who had been hired to make new curtains for the mansion and had never returned home from her final appointment. There was James Fletcher, a traveling preacher who had stopped to offer spiritual counsel to the family and had last been seen entering their front door. There was even Robert Sinclair, a federal tax collector who had come to audit the family's business records and had simply disappeared without filing his report. In each case, the official explanation was the same. The missing person had left town suddenly for personal reasons, or had met with some unfortunate accident while traveling the dangerous mountain roads. But Crawford's trained eye could see the flaws in these explanations, the inconsistencies that suggested a far more deliberate pattern of elimination. As the detective dug deeper into the family's history, he began to uncover evidence of a criminal enterprise that went far beyond simple murder. Financial records suggested that the Whitmores were involved in a complex web of fraud, extortion, and theft that had made them wealthy at the expense of countless victims. But money seemed to be only part of their motivation. There were indications that the family was involved in activities that were so depraved and disturbing that Crawford found himself questioning whether such things were even possible in civilized society. The breakthrough in the investigation came from an unexpected source. One of the former construction workers who had helped build the mysterious basement rooms approached Crawford in secret, offering to provide information in exchange for protection from the Whitmore family's retribution. The worker's name was Thomas McKenna, and the fear in his weathered face was unmistakable as he met Crawford in an abandoned mill on the outskirts of town. McKenna had worked construction for over 20 years, he explained, and he had seen his share of unusual building projects. But what he had witnessed during the renovation of the Whitmore mansion had shaken him to his very core. McKenna revealed that the basement modifications were far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The Whitmores had essentially created a second house beneath their mansion, complete with multiple rooms, corridors, and what appeared to be specialized chambers, designed for purposes that made his blood run cold. The steel doors weren't just for security, he explained. They were soundproof, designed to contain whatever happened behind them. Most disturbing of all was McKenna's account of the drainage system he had been hired to install. The network of pipes and tunnels didn't just lead to the outside of the house, as most people assumed. Instead, they connected to a series of underground chambers that extended beneath the family's property, like the roots of some monstrous tree. McKenna had discovered human bones while digging the foundations for these tunnels, bones that appeared to be relatively fresh and showed signs of deliberate mutilation. When McKenna had questioned his supervisor about the bones, he was told to forget what he had seen and never speak of it again. But the nightmares had started that very night, and they hadn't stopped since. He described dreams filled with screaming voices, echoing through underground passages, of shadowy figures moving through candlelit chambers, and of the unmistakable stench of death that seemed to permeate every corner of the Whitmore estate. Armed with this new information, Crawford began to piece together a theory that was so horrific it challenged everything he thought he knew about human nature. The Whitmore family wasn't just eliminating people who posed a threat to their business interests. They were operating some kind of systematic killing operation, possibly for profit, possibly for pleasure, or perhaps for reasons that were even more twisted than simple greed or sadism. The detective's investigation took on new urgency when he received word that another person had gone missing. This time, it was a young woman named Elizabeth Thornton, the daughter of a local merchant who had been courting one of the Whitmore boys. Elizabeth had last been seen walking toward the mansion for what she believed was a dinner invitation from the family. When she failed to return home that evening, her father immediately contacted the authorities. Crawford knew that he was running out of time. If his suspicions were correct, Elizabeth Thornton was in mortal danger, assuming she was still alive at all. But mounting a direct assault on the Whitmore estate would require evidence that would hold up in court, and so far, everything he had uncovered was circumstantial at best. The detective decided to take a calculated risk. Using his authority as a state investigator, he obtained a warrant to search the Whitmore property for evidence related to the missing persons cases. He knew that Jeremiah would likely challenge the warrant through his political connections, but Crawford hoped that the element of surprise would give him enough time to find the proof he needed. On the morning of June 15th, 1887, Crawford arrived at the Whitmore mansion with a team of 6 deputies and a local magistrate to oversee the search. The family received them with their usual cold politeness, but the detective could sense the tension crackling in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Jeremiah's eyes had taken on a dangerous glint, and his sons positioned themselves around the house in a way that suggested they were prepared for violence, if necessary. The search of the main floors of the house yielded little evidence beyond what Crawford had expected to find. The Whitmores were too careful and too experienced at covering their tracks to leave obvious clues lying around. But when the detective and his team descended into the basement levels, they discovered a nightmare that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The underground chambers that McKenna had described were even more horrific than the construction worker had suggested. Room after room contained evidence of unspeakable acts, from blood-stained tables equipped with restraints to collections of personal belongings that clearly came from dozens of different victims. The smell that Crawford had noticed during his dinner at the mansion was overwhelming in the basement, a combination of death, chemicals, and something else that defied identification. In one room, they found what appeared to be a makeshift medical laboratory, complete with surgical instruments, specimen jars, and detailed anatomical drawings that suggested someone had been conducting experiments on living human subjects. Another chamber contained what could only be described as a torture chamber, with devices designed to inflict maximum pain while keeping victims alive for extended periods. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was made in the deepest part of the underground complex. Behind a hidden door that required 3 different keys to open, Crawford found a room that served as a grotesque trophy collection. The walls were lined with shelves containing hundreds of items that had clearly been taken from victims: jewelry, watches, photographs, locks of hair, and other personal mementos. In the center of the room sat a large leather-bound ledger that documented each acquisition with the methodical precision of a business inventory. As Crawford flipped through the pages of the ledger, he realized that the Whitmore family's crimes stretched back much further than anyone had imagined. The earliest entries dated to 1873, just 8 years after Jeremiah's marriage to Margaret. The records indicated that the family had systematically murdered at least 147 people over the course of 14 years, with the frequency of killings increasing dramatically in recent months. The ledger also revealed the true scope of the family's criminal enterprise. They weren't just killing randomly or even just eliminating threats to their business. The Whitmores were operating what amounted to a murder-for-hire service, accepting contracts from wealthy clients who wanted specific individuals eliminated. They were also engaged in what appeared to be a form of human trafficking, capturing travelers and selling them to unnamed buyers in distant cities. Most chilling of all were the entries that suggested the family was experimenting with their victims before killing them. Joshua's medical training wasn't being used to help people, but rather to develop new methods of torture and to study the limits of human endurance. Some entries described keeping victims alive for weeks or even months, while subjecting them to increasingly horrific treatment. As Crawford continued his examination of the underground chambers, he began to understand the full extent of the family's depravity. This wasn't just a criminal operation, it was a systematic assault on human dignity and decency that had been carried out by people who had completely abandoned any pretense of moral behavior. The search team discovered evidence that suggested the family had been disposing of bodies through multiple methods. Some victims had been dissolved in acid baths that left only traces of bone and teeth. Others had been dismembered and fed to pigs kept in a hidden pen behind the mansion. Still others had been buried in unmarked graves scattered throughout the family's extensive property holdings. But even as Crawford gathered this overwhelming evidence of the Whitmore family's crimes, he realized that his investigation had uncovered something even more disturbing than mass murder. The ledger contained references to clients and associates that suggested the family was part of a much larger network of criminals operating throughout the region. Names and locations were mentioned that indicated similar operations might be running in at least 6 other states. The detective also found evidence that some of the family's victims hadn't been killed for money or to eliminate threats. Instead, they appeared to have been selected specifically for the pleasure their suffering would provide. Detailed descriptions of torture sessions read like the fantasies of someone who had lost all connection to human empathy, someone who derived genuine satisfaction from inflicting pain and terror on helpless victims. As the search continued, Crawford made another horrifying discovery. In a chamber that appeared to serve as living quarters, he found Elizabeth Thornton. The young woman was alive, but barely recognizable as the vibrant girl who had disappeared just days earlier. She had been subjected to treatment that had left her physically and mentally shattered, capable of little more than incoherent mumbling about darkness and endless screaming. The rescue of Elizabeth Thornton provided Crawford with a living witness to the family's crimes, but her condition also demonstrated just how thorough the Whitmores had become at destroying their victims even when they chose to keep them alive. The detective realized that even if Elizabeth eventually recovered enough to testify, her account would be so disturbing that few people would be able to believe that such things were possible. The discovery of the underground chambers and their contents provided Crawford with more than enough evidence to arrest the entire Whitmore family. But as his team prepared to take the family members into custody, they encountered unexpected resistance. Jeremiah and his sons had used the time during the search to arm themselves and prepare for what they clearly viewed as a final confrontation. The shootout that followed would be remembered as one of the bloodiest law enforcement actions in Pennsylvania history. Samuel Whitmore was killed while trying to destroy evidence in the basement laboratory. The twins, Joshua and Caleb, barricaded themselves in different parts of the house and had to be overcome by force, with Caleb ultimately taking his own life rather than face capture. Jeremiah himself proved to be as dangerous in his final moments as he had been throughout his criminal career. Armed with multiple weapons and protected by his intimate knowledge of the mansion's layout, he managed to hold off Crawford's team for nearly 2 hours while systematically destroying as much evidence as possible. When he was finally cornered in his study, he attempted to negotiate his surrender in exchange for information about his criminal associates. But Crawford had seen too much horror in the basement chambers to consider any kind of deal with the man responsible for it all. The final confrontation between the detective and the patriarch of the Whitmore clan lasted only minutes, but it would haunt Crawford's dreams for the rest of his life. Even facing certain death, Jeremiah showed no remorse for his crimes, no regret for the suffering he had caused. Instead, he seemed genuinely proud of what he had accomplished and frustrated only that his work would remain unfinished. The aftermath of the raid on the Whitmore mansion sent shockwaves through the community and beyond. As word of the family's crimes spread, people struggled to comprehend how such systematic evil could have existed in their midst for so many years. The scale of the horror discovered in the basement chambers was so overwhelming that many newspapers refused to publish the complete details, fearing that their readers would dismiss the accounts as sensationalized fiction. Margaret Whitmore and her daughter Abigail were taken into custody along with the rest of the family, but their cases presented unique challenges for the authorities. Both women appeared to have been victims of the family's violence as much as participants in it. Margaret had clearly suffered years of abuse that had left her mentally incompetent, while Abigail showed signs of having been coerced into participating in activities that had traumatized her beyond recovery. The question of what to do with little Thomas proved even more complicated. At 12 years old, he was clearly too young to be held responsible for the family's crimes, but he had been exposed to horrors that had fundamentally damaged his ability to function in normal society. The boy's testimony, given in closed sessions with court-appointed psychiatrists, revealed that he had been forced to witness acts of torture and murder from a very young age as part of what his father called his education. As investigators continued to process the evidence found in the Whitmore mansion, the true scope of the family's criminal enterprise became clear. The network of clients and associates mentioned in Jeremiah's ledger led to investigations in multiple states, uncovering what appeared to be an organized conspiracy involving dozens of wealthy and powerful individuals who had used the Whitmore family's services to eliminate their enemies and satisfy their darkest impulses. The trials that followed would drag on for months, with testimony so disturbing that several jurors had to be excused due to emotional breakdown. The defense attorneys struggled to find any way to mitigate the overwhelming evidence of their client's guilt, ultimately settling on arguments about mental incompetence and coercion that satisfied no one. But even as the legal proceedings unfolded, strange events continued to occur around the Whitmore property. Construction workers hired to seal off the basement chambers reported hearing unexplained sounds coming from below ground. Local residents claimed to see lights moving through the abandoned mansion at night, and several people reported encounters with figures that resembled members of the dead Whitmore family. The community's attempts to move forward from the Whitmore tragedy were complicated by the discovery that the family's criminal network extended far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. Detective Crawford's investigation had opened a door to a world of organized evil that reached into the highest levels of society, implicating judges, politicians, and business leaders throughout the region. As the trials concluded, the surviving members of the Whitmore family met their fate in various ways. Margaret, deemed mentally incompetent due to years of psychological torture, was committed to a state asylum where she would spend her remaining days in a catatonic state, never again speaking coherently about the horrors she had witnessed. Abigail, despite evidence that she had been coerced into participating in some of the family's activities, was sentenced to life imprisonment. She would die in her cell 3 years later, having never recovered from the trauma that had consumed her young life. The question of little Thomas haunted the community long after the trials ended. The boy had been placed in the care of distant relatives, but reports from his guardians painted a disturbing picture of a child whose mind had been irreparably damaged by his exposure to his family's depravity. Thomas would disappear from his new home on his 16th birthday, leaving behind only a note that read, "The darkness calls me home." His body was never found, though some claimed to have seen a figure matching his description wandering the ruins of the old Whitmore estate on moonless nights. The mansion itself became a source of ongoing controversy for the townspeople. Many demanded that the structure be burned to the ground, believing that such evil could never be fully cleansed from the site. Others argued that the building should be preserved as evidence of the crimes that had taken place there, a reminder to future generations of what human beings were capable of when they abandoned all moral restraints. In the end, a compromise was reached. The main structure was demolished, but the basement chambers were sealed with concrete and left as they were. A simple marker was placed on the site, bearing only the dates of the investigation and the words, "Never again." But even this modest memorial proved controversial, with some arguing that any acknowledgement of the Whitmore family's existence was too much recognition for such monsters. The ripple effects of the Whitmore case extended far beyond the immediate community. Detective Crawford's investigation had exposed a network of corruption and criminal activity that reached into multiple state governments, leading to dozens of additional arrests and convictions. Several prominent politicians and business leaders were forced to resign in disgrace, while others fled to foreign countries to avoid prosecution. The case also prompted significant changes in law enforcement procedures throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states. New protocols were established for investigating missing persons cases, and special units were created to identify and disrupt organized criminal networks. The horror of what had been allowed to continue for so many years under the noses of local authorities led to widespread reforms in how police departments handled cases involving influential families. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Whitmore case was the way it changed how people thought about evil itself. Prior to the investigation, most folks believed that true wickedness was the province of obviously deranged individuals who could be easily identified and avoided. The Whitmores had demonstrated that the most dangerous monsters could hide behind facades of respectability and social standing, using their wealth and influence to protect themselves while they committed unspeakable acts. Years passed, and the community slowly began to heal from the trauma of learning what had been happening in their midst. New families moved into town, businesses reopened, and life gradually returned to something resembling normalcy. But those who had lived through the revelations about the Whitmore family were forever changed by the experience. Detective Crawford himself never fully recovered from what he had witnessed in those basement chambers. He continued his career in law enforcement for several more years, but colleagues noted that he had become withdrawn and suspicious, seeing potential threats where others saw only ordinary human behavior. He would often speak of the investigation as the moment when he lost his faith in the fundamental goodness of humanity. In his final report on the case, Crawford wrote words that would be quoted by criminologists and psychologists for decades to come. "I have stared into the depths of human depravity and found that there is no bottom to that pit." The Whitmore family showed us that evil is not some external force that possesses the weak, but rather a choice that ordinary people can make when they decide that their desires matter more than the lives and dignity of their fellow human beings. The detective retired from active duty in 1892 and spent his remaining years writing a detailed account of the investigation that would become one of the most studied documents in the history of American criminal justice. But even Crawford's meticulous documentation could not fully capture the horror of what had been discovered in that underground maze of chambers and corridors. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Whitmore case faded from newspaper headlines and public consciousness. Other scandals and tragedies captured the nation's attention, and the story of Pennsylvania's most notorious family became just another dark chapter in America's criminal history. But for those who remembered, the name Whitmore continued to carry a weight that went far beyond the simple facts of their crimes. The 7 graves in the hillside cemetery stand as silent testimony to the end of a bloodline that should never have existed. Jeremiah, Samuel, Joshua, Caleb, Margaret, Abigail, and little Thomas, whose body was never found but whose death was assumed, all lie beneath weathered headstones that bear no epitaphs, no expressions of love or loss from grieving relatives. The community had decided that even in death, the Whitmore family deserved no words of comfort or remembrance. Visitors to the cemetery today often ask about those unmarked graves, wondering why 7 members of the same family all died within such a short span of time. The locals who know the story usually change the subject or offer vague explanations about illness or accident. The truth is simply too disturbing to share with casual inquiries from strangers who are unprepared for such darkness. But on quiet evenings, when the mist rolls down from the mountains and settles over the old cemetery, some say you can still feel the presence of the Whitmore family's victims. Not the ghosts of the perpetrators themselves, but rather the spirits of those 147 souls who suffered and died in those basement chambers. They serve as eternal witnesses to crimes that must never be forgotten, no matter how much time passes or how desperately the living wish to put such horrors behind them. The true legacy of the Whitmore family is not the wealth they accumulated or the fear they inspired during their years of power. Instead, it is the lesson they taught about the importance of vigilance against evil, regardless of how well it disguises itself behind respectability and social standing. Their story reminds us that the greatest monsters are often those who walk among us undetected, using our trust and our tendency to look the other way as weapons against the innocent. As you walk past those 7 graves on the hillside, remember that the Whitmore family's greatest crime was not the murders they committed or the suffering they inflicted. It was their betrayal of the basic human contract that binds us all together, their decision to treat their fellow beings as nothing more than objects to be used and discarded for their own twisted purposes. The Whitmore name died with that bloodline, but the evil they represented continues to exist in the world, waiting for the next opportunity to take root and flourish in darkness. The only defense against such monsters is the courage to speak truth about what we see, even when that truth is too terrible to believe. The victims who died in those basement chambers deserve nothing less than our eternal vigilance against the forces that destroyed them. And so the story of the Whitmore family serves as both a warning and a promise. A warning that evil can flourish anywhere, even in the most respectable of families and communities. And a promise that eventually truth will prevail over deception, justice will triumph over corruption, and the light will drive back the darkness, no matter how deep or how complete that darkness may seem. The hills of Pennsylvania keep many secrets, but none darker than the one that lies beneath those 7 unmarked graves. May the Whitmore family rest in whatever peace such souls can find, and may their victims finally know the justice that was denied them in life. This is their story, told so that we might never forget the price of looking away when evil walks among us, wearing the mask of respectability.